Imbento lang.
Welcome to Imbento Lang, the show where we delve into the minds of Filipino inventors and innovators who have left an indelible mark on science and technology. I'm your host, Steve, and today we have the privilege of talking to Dr. Ricky Guerrero. Dr. Ricardo Jose Sta Guerrero, or Doc Ricky, is a talented engineer with a passion for creating biomedical devices that meet the needs of the Philippines and other developing countries. After earning his Ph.D. at the University of Edinburgh, where he developed microchip sensors to measure cancer tumor oxygen levels, Ricky turned to the Philippines to continue his impactful work. Ricky's educational journey started at the Philippine Science High School main campus and took him to the University of Waterloo in Canada, where he earned a degree in Nanotechnology Engineering. His research experience spans across prestigious institutions like the National Institute for Material Science in Japan, MIT, and Safran Landing Systems, where he worked on various innovative projects. Currently, Ricky is a Balik scientist and a research fellow at the Ateneo Research Institute for Science and Engineering, or ARISE. He previously led the DOST PCHRD funded project developing a microfluidic PCR device which aims to make DNA testing more accessible and affordable to local scientists. He is one of the minds behind UnSilo Labs, a team of toolmakers dedicated to empowering the Philippine biotechnology seen through the development of instruments and platform technologies and synthesis of materials. He also currently advises the engineering arm of the Integrated Protein R&D Center, IPRDC, which is funded under the DOST Niche Centers in the Region, or NICER program. Join us as we uncover the stories of Filipino inventors. This is Imbento Lang. Stay tuned for a conversation with Doc Ricky. Hello, Doc Ricky. Welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you here and for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. Really happy to join and be able to share some of my experiences trying to do research here in the Philippines.
Let's talk about you as an innovator. Could you tell me more about yourself and the work that you do?
So currently I'm a Balik scientist with ARISE, the Ateneo Research Institute of Science and Engineering. Right now, we're working on projects which have to do with creating the local production of proteins. So these are proteins which can be used for things like diagnostic assays, possibly for agricultural uses, for the treatment of plants, or things like wastewater remediation. You could create these proteins which can break down or sequester heavy metals. We're also working on things in the realm of microfluidics, which is more for doing like automation, semi-automation of complex lab procedures. So these are what they call lab-on-a-chip systems. And that's, I think that's currently what we're working on in ARISE. And this is with my team. We call ourselves UnSilo, the UnSilo Labs. So we're a multidisciplinary team because it really takes all sorts to solve the hard problems that we have here in the Philippines.
Sure. And before we get into the UnSilo Labs and the actual products and services, could you tell me what inspired you or motivated you to become a scientist in the first place?
I always sort of wanted to figure out how things worked, right? So I don't quite remember myself, but I've always been told as a kid I'd take apart things and take a look at the insides, hopefully put them back together and keep them working again. But in general, I always enjoyed trying to understand the nature of the things that, how things work. Actually, before deciding to do engineering, I was actually more inclined towards science and physics. So really more core understanding upon the physical mechanisms of how things work. During the application, as a student and applying to colleges, it sort of I was more attracted to the applied side of things. So yes, it's good to understand how things work, but then with that understanding, what can you do to solve the problems that everyone sort of faces? So that's what drew me to engineering as opposed to just the pure sciences, at least during the time of college applications.
Right.
Initially, I was actually I'd been accepted at Ateneo to physics MSc. But because my family had emigrated, that's how I ended up going to Canada instead, because I went with my family after high school. So that's how I ended up in Canada studying nanotechnology engineering. So it is more at that transition point where I started veering towards engineering as a discipline.
What made you go back to the Philippines? And were there any specific needs or problems that you kind of like identified?
I had sort of decided to go back to the Philippines maybe a year or two before I finished my PhD.
Mhm.
It's because I've worked in many research labs, prior to coming back, as a research intern, as a scientist, and a lot of the research that occurs in research labs, especially abroad, is research that is there to advance, humanity's sum total knowledge of science, which is all well and good. But the majority, if yeah, almost all the projects I worked on never left the research lab, right? They led to some really high impact papers.
Yeah.
They led to some really good research, lots of skills training, but they were stuck in the lab, right? And when I did my PhD in Edinburgh, it was sort of the same thing. I was working on microchip sensors for cancer tumor measurements, and looking at the course of that, and looking at the way that these funding structure works for these complex projects, even in the UK, it didn't seem very likely. Like unless you were actually in charge of the development and the overall project management, right? It wouldn't be pushed past the development stage that we had done in the research lab. So, I figured that if I wanted to continue doing research that I wanted to do, as opposed to going to industry and doing research what I'd be kind of told to do to some extent. If I had stayed abroad, it'd be the same, right? The KPIs, the metrics I'd be chasing would be more for publications, more so than for actual, good. And there's this need, I think, that at least for me, and I know the people I work with as well, that we want to be able to use the things that we know, our skills and our experiences, to actually solve problems which matter. And coming back to the Philippines would allow me to solve problems we knew, as being Filipino, are important and are overlooked because there aren't people who are actively trying to solve them, I guess, systematically. So coming to Ateneo allowed me to work on projects and problems I think were important. And it's also why we have a really big push within our research group to ensure that the things that we do are things which are not going to be stuck in the lab. And while we do aim for publications, because they are, of course, a metric for many things, personally, I think for all of us, for our personal satisfaction, our real metrics would be making sure that this research is actually useful to the people who need it the most. So getting it out of the lab, making sure it's a sustainable thing, which would either mean commercialization of some sort, manufacturing, and yeah, I think that's ended up why coming back to the Philippines. There are also other things as well. My family has a history of leaving and coming back.
Yeah.
My grandfather and my grandmother and my other grandfather, they did their PhDs abroad on scholarship. They came back to the Philippines. My dad did his training. He's a doctor. He did his training abroad. He also came back, which is why I did high school in Philippine Science. I went out in grade school for a bit as well before he had to leave again because
Right.
it's hard to live in the Philippines. And I guess following their footsteps, maybe not quite intentionally, but look, in retrospect, it's like, oh yeah, I kind of maybe there's some sort of family genetic memory going on there. Ended up coming back.
There could be.
There could be. Who
Yeah.
knows?
Let's talk about UnSilo Labs. And I mentioned you're one of the brains behind this venture. Could you tell me more about the work that UnSilo Labs does?
So UnSilo Labs, so I guess philosophically from the name itself, right? We're attempting to unsilo the different disciplines, different bodies of knowledge, different levels of expertise, to sort of tackle the problems that we have identified, we've been told about, that we want to work on within the Philippine context. So I say one of minds of because even though I helped start it, it really isn't. It has to be a collaborative entity. Everybody's perspectives and expertise and experiences matter in terms of trying to solve the problems proposed to us. I'm very much a generalist. I I always tell people that the only way I ever do any work is because I work with people much smarter than me. My job is really to translate between the different people, like the chemists talk to the physicists, talk to the biologists. That's where I come in handy. But in terms of the, the very detailed, like like really detailed, like say chemistry or organic synthesis or the molecular biology, I leave that to the experts. I won't call myself an expert in any of those things, but we work with them, which is important, right? We work with experts and practitioners within those fields, and by breaking down those, those silos, hence 𝗚𝗂𝗀𝘁𝘂𝘁, that really allows us to tackle the problems which really encompass all of these different fields. And I know at the moment we are very much a STEM group, but it's also important to us to try and branch out once we have a more solid foundation. We really want to ensure that we work more closely with the social science as well, the political science, because engineering, because right now we're engineers. And the thing about engineers is that engineers don't make solutions. They develop potential solutions. The actual implementation, the adoption, the uptake, and the usage don't depend on us. They will depend on the people. They'll depend on regulators, policymakers, politicians, and if we keep on developing in a vacuum, it's not as, at the end of the day, like I said, we want to ensure that what we do is useful and effective, and we can't do that just being engineers.
So how do you think that would work? Could you take us through your innovation process and coming from the idea stage down to involving these people from different disciplines?
Right. So I guess we can talk more about the first project that we worked on. So this would be during COVID. We worked on the MyPCR project, which is funded by the PCHRD. So at the beginning of the pandemic, molecular biology was, studied in universities, but it was not necessarily really a thing. There was a survey conducted by some grad students at the beginning of COVID, trying to figure out just academically how many PCR machines exist in the country. I think they came up to like 30, right? 30 PCR machines for the entire country.
What does the price of a PCR machine usually cost?
It's variable, but on average, I think the one that got bought the most often during the pandemic to scale of capacities was 4 to 10 million pesos.
Wow.
Right. So this is, there's no prior investment into making sure molecular biology was, an accessible technology for the things that we do. Right. It was the realm of maybe forensics labs, academic labs, research labs, maybe a few really well equipped primary hospitals, but as a whole, it was just not a thing. So that's why when I and my teammates were trying to figure out what to do when COVID hit, we figured that we had this combined skills to try and help deal with that lack of infrastructure, that lack of accessibility. So on my end, because my background was in engineering, electronics, microfluidics, and I had broad enough vocabulary to speak to the medical guys and the biology guys, I worked on making the MyPCR, which is the microfluidic PCR device, which would allow for a lower cost machine, which would do the PCR or the eventually isothermal amplification of COVID test kits.
Okay.
And this was done in parallel with the development of a COVID test kit here in Ateneo, and also in parallel with some policy research being done by my colleague to try and figure out what exactly was the medical device regulatory landscape within the Philippines, because COVID was unprecedented, so no one really tested the regulation and seen what could actually be done. So that's where the MyPCR project came from, and it's from there where it sort of became apparent that you really need all sorts of people working on hard problems, because I could not have done the MyPCR project alone without the input of clinicians, without the input of molecular biologists, because I just didn't know enough about those. So there's really a component which requires dialogue and understanding with the different parties to try to sort out like what what's actually possible, right? There are many times where I would talk to a doctor and I'm like, well, this is like a hard problem over here. I don't quite have the tool set to deal with it. We don't have the equipment. And said, well, you don't actually have to do that, because if that's your problem, you can actually do this a different thing instead, this parallel solution. And it's like, oh, so there's actually this there's like a complexity budget, right? If Yeah, it's called a complexity budget. So if you think of a problem as being budgeted by the total amount of complexity that you can handle, if there's only a single discipline or this single avenue that you can take, then you have to load all of the solving of that complexity within a single field. In our case, it would be engineering. But because we work closely with clinicians, we work closely with molecular biologists, I say, oh, this is very technically hard on the engineering side. The molecular biologists say, well, actually, we can reduce the temperature of this kit by like 5 degrees Celsius. And it's like, oh, well, that completely solves all the problems, increases the complexity on the biology side, but drastically decreases the complexity on the engineering side. Right. So there's, it's by having this proper understanding of the different disciplines and seeing where, what can give and what can take, you can come up with a solution which is more efficiently or more ideally tailored to the exact problem that is trying to be solved there.
Were there any frustrations with working with different disciplines and expertise?
Personally, not particularly. I think nothing outside the realm of just working with other people in general. At least for me, I'm given my strange academic background with nanotechnology engineering, being from Philippine Science, like I had to have a broad enough vocabulary and understanding of the different fields to know when I don't know something too well, right? I think that's the important part. You have to, if you don't know what you don't know, then you're never going to be able to actually address the issues that lie within that sphere. But if you try to know what you don't know, then at least you can work towards addressing that or find the people who do know those things that you don't know, and that helps to solve those issues. But yeah, any sort of collaborative project will require a degree of soft skills, right? I think that's something that is usually overlooked as being necessary within highly technical fields. But the thing is that like I said with UnSilo, any sort of hard problem will require solutions from all over with many people. It's always going to be about finding the right team, building the right sort of expertise required. So not a single person could do this alone. There's no solitary genius who understands. Well, maybe there could be, but there aren't enough of them. So the only other alternative is to get enough people, build a good enough team with enough expertise and knowledge to actually work on those problems from all angles. So like if we're talking about the complexity budget, we can actually reduce complexity across all the different disciplines at the same time to come up with the easiest solution.
Yeah, that's actually quite a good strategy on, inventing and developing products. And it's well and good that you have the idea down, you have your needs or the problem like identified. Could you tell me more about your prototyping or your product development journey? I assume you've gotten several prototypes or versions of your final product?
Yes, many iterations. It's always going to be an iterative process because, like I said, if you think about these things that you don't know, right? The only way you can actually figure out what those might be is by trying it, right? And let me try and think of a good example for this. When we first tried to do microflake fabrication in the Philippines, no one was done microflakes in the Philippines before. For some reason, probably because it usually requires expensive clean room equipment like full lithography systems. Sure. And until recently, now there is someone who has an academic clean room. Until recently, no one could actually even attempt to do these things. So we tried to do more rapid prototyping of these designs for microfluidics, and it was just we had no idea what we were doing. We had literature, of course, but there are always things left out in written correspondence that don't carry across. So we tried using laser cutting, right, to make these tiny etched channels on only to find out that even if you look at the photos in a journal, it's like, oh, these are all like perfectly straight and smooth. Maybe 1 out of 100 of the things we made were perfectly straight and smooth. So that's probably made
Right.
publication in the other guys' work. But we found that so many other, like many of the different parameters for the laser cutting really affects the topography of the chip, which affects downstream, like the sealing and the flow of fluids. So, we had to do prototyping on that end. But in general, I think what's important, what we attempt to do, at least in the projects that we worked on, is try to develop what they call like game development, like a vertical slice. So a vertical slice is where you try to take every single system and functionality that should be in the final product and compress the scope enough so that it's an easy thing to do, right? So let's say like in a video game, you have like 20 like say it's a shooter or whatever, it's like 20 weapons eventually. In a vertical slice, you'd have one weapon implemented very well,
Okay.
so that when you have to expand it down the line into a final product, you at least have a foundation to build off of. So it's like building a really skinny tower that works, but that helps to at least uncover the problems that you're going to have when you're building the entire thing. And that's of course going to be an iterative process. For the MyPCR, I think we went over at least 4 major iterations and uncountable number of minor iterations in terms of getting to the final design. And each of those we're trying to answer specific technical questions about, could this be done, right? Because one of the things, especially when you're working on things which have not been done, the question you always have to ask yourself is this even possible? Like, is it physically, like, are you breaking laws of physics? Are you, it's like trying to build a perpetual motion machine, right? Is it even technically possible? So they're like, sanity checks, experiments. Like there's this one thing that no one had ever, prior to COVID, not a lot of people had looked at the PCR product like visually. Like it always been done by a machine, and we wanted to know, like, could we just look at it and see if it glows? And nobody had ever reported in literature, like, had they looked at this thing after it glows. So one of the first experiments we had to do is like, if we take this tube out of the machine at the end, can we look at it and see if it glows? And it glowed. So
Wow.
right, it's like we don't know, so we have to just try it. It's also important to try and bring down the cost of the iterations as well, right? And there are many ways to do that. But at least, especially if you're on the scrappy end, like we had in our current project with the IPRDC, we're making materials like nanomaterials, and procurement in the Philippines can be challenging.
Right.
So we put in our order. It said, okay, it'll take like 2-3 months to get the reagents, and we're like, that's a bit too long. So we bought the reagents off of Lazada, not chemical use at all. We bought some PCB etchant, we bought some bleach, we bought some iron wool. And this is why it's important to have a fundamental understanding or having experts who do so, because these are all just chemicals, right? Yes, they're not the purity you would buy them from like the proper chemical supplier, but we can do a cheap, cost us maybe less than 1,000 pesos experiment to verify, like, yes, this is a thing that will work. And if it will work on this really bad batch of reagents, it'll definitely work with our high purity, expensive ones. So we got those things, and then our skilled chemist got those reagents, purified them a little bit, turned them into the actual reagents we would need, and was able to successfully make magnetic nanoparticles, which is what we're using now for drawing out the expensive enzymes and proteins from the cellular bath.
I'm curious. You've mentioned earlier about having low cost, these rough prototypes that you've purchased off of commercial like Lazada and those e-commerce platforms. And how does that affect your design? Does it even like have an impact on it? Because you have your sub quality materials in.
So I mean, the thing is, right, you have to look at, I guess as an engineer, I look at things as just functional building blocks. Like if it will achieve the functionality required for this specific process, then it should work, right? That's just how that's how science and engineering works. So we knew that this was a functionally like bleach is just bleach, right? They used a more concentrated version in the literature reactions, but this should absolutely work, no questions asked. Science is science. Of course, you have to prove that it will work, right? Like there is the theoretical understanding, and there's the actual embodiment of the knowledge into a thing. Um, but that's why, like, if you know it should work, then it probably should work. And if it doesn't work, then you have to ask yourself, why didn't it work? You have to narrow down the sources of error. Because if you can't get to work now, what are the chances that when you do it later? Like there's always a um, there's always a temptation to try and solve the problems by going bigger or more expensive. But if you don't, or just run more trials, but if there's a fundamental misunderstanding in how things are happening, then you're not going to be able to solve that problem, because at that point you're just shotgunning the answer, right? You're just hoping that some combination of these parameters will work itself out. But if you actually know what's going on at the fundamental level, then you can actually address the specific problem that's happening there and narrow it down. And I guess that's really my because my undergrad is in nanotechnology engineering, having a bottom-up understanding. That's how I would approach things in general in terms of troubleshooting and problem solving.
So doing that rough prototype at the get-go really helps in building a more robust final product, and more like that answers the needs, the actual needs, or the features that your users want. I would like to ask, who are your stakeholders for this particular product?
So for the IPRDC, which is the Integrated Protein Research and Development Center, the overall goal of this program is to create recombinant proteins. So these are proteins which are expressed by bacteria, or things, in our case, E. coli or yeast. Then you put in the genetic code and you make them into mini factories, right? This cell is now your factory to make a thing that you want. In our case, the thing that we want are the proteins and the enzymes that go into molecular biology test kits. Because if you look at the cost breakdown of a COVID test kit, one of the biggest cost drivers is going to be the enzymes. And these are because they're all produced elsewhere, right? They're also very temperature sensitive, like there's a shelf life. So if you're producing them in the US or in Europe or in China, by the time it gets here, there can be issues.
Yeah.
So enzymes are very expensive. So in the program, we are using these cells, co-opting them, turning them into mini factories for the enzymes, and then we also purify them. So the cells, you can't just, at least in our cells, you have to basically destroy the factory and sift through the rubble, right? It's all mixed in with the junk. So you have to purify those enzymes from that thing, which we call cellular lysate. And that's when you actually have a final product which is usable for inclusion in test kits, in the COVID test kits. So we get those proteins, and that's what are the final products. But also within the program, we at the onset, we realized that no one is doing this, and no one's doing it here, because just like with the PCR machines, it's just very expensive to get going, right? The equipment required to do to grow the cells, to grow the cells, which is done inside of what they call a cellular bioreactor. That's very expensive, hard to get. We actually got one for the project. I think we spent like 3 million pesos just to get one. It took like a year and a half. So we're actually making cellular bioreactors as part of the IPRDC. So UnSilo is the engineering arm, and the engineering arm is making the bioreactors. We're making the purification systems, the liquid chromatography systems, and we're also making the materials which are used to, I guess, sift through the rubble, right? We're making those magnetic nanoparticles. We're making those beads which can be used to like filter through the waste and find those proteins in them. So even though we're doing the scientific and the applied side of doing the biology, we're also working to make sure that that sort of research success is accessible and sustainable, not just within IPRDC, but also ensure that when we make sure that this leaves the lab, this will actually enable other people who are doing research in biotechnology in the Philippines to actually do the research that we're doing, right? Because if at the moment there's maybe like 3-4 research groups in the Philippines working on this sort of recombinant protein process to develop high value biomolecules, if we're successful and we develop our bioreactors and our chromatography systems and develop the materials to run them, that means that if we bring down the price dramatically,
Right.
or if we work with partners, we can make sure that more people are working on the same problems with the same technologies, right? Biotechnology does not have to be something which is done purely within well-equipped research labs. Like we will equip the research labs in other places to solve the problems that they might have that they may have that they can use biotechnology to solve. So some people we talked to who might be interested in this, right? We presented our research in a couple places. There's one research group that found a microbe which, when applied to rice, I believe, makes it extremely drought resistant.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they found a bacteria. So the thing is, they found a bacteria. They can grow it inside their lab, but they don't have a cellular bioreactor, right?
Mhm.
They don't have the liquid. They don't have the liquid chromatography system. So they can make like maybe a liter of this stuff, maybe 5 liters. But what if you want to do a pilot study, right? This is rice we're talking about. You need hectares.
Hectares, right?
Hectares of rice. For a pilot study, maybe like 3 hectares. You're going to need hundreds of liters, thousands of liters of this, and it can't be done in their lab because they don't have the equipment to scale up to the level for pilot production. So they were very interested when they found out that we were making these cellular bioreactors. They wanted to buy one right away because like we need one. It's like, well, we're still working on it. We want to make sure that when we give you at least even an alpha prototype, that we're sure that it will work. But these are the kind of, I guess, stories that we've encountered working in this field. Like we have these, we talk to other researchers, we talk to educators. Like, well, can we have this inside of our classroom? Like, can we use this to teach the undergrads or even
Right.
high school students? Right? Can we make this a technology which, because we don't have it. Well, we have. Sorry, we have. Just to be clear, we have biotechnology in the Philippines, but it's heavily. When you say biotechnology, we think of things like BT eggplant and golden rice.
Mhm.
But biotechnology is such a wide encompassing field. This in particular is like recombinant protein biotechnology. So no, very few people are working on it now. But again, if we enable this technology to be accessed by educators and researchers, then this is now a new tool in the toolkit of the Filipinos to solve problems that we actually do have.
And
Right?
it's low cost at that.
Yes,
Quite relatively.
there are some things will be expensive in general. Like some things require expensive things, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Like sensors require expensive materials that go into them, things like that. But it's also low cost. It's also just more easily acquired. Because again, we spent $4 million, but we also spent like a year and a half waiting.
Mm.
That's such a long time to wait for a piece of equipment. If we were elsewhere, this would be here in like a month max, But we're here. And on top of that, at least for the bioreactors and the LC systems, we're actually working on an open source model to ensure that we can actually just release this out into the wild. So if people wanted to or had the inclination or the ability to do so, they could build it for themselves. But at least from our sustainability standpoint, we're interested in following the steps of and the producer like making kits or even like full machines down the line, so that if you're a biologist, maybe you don't want to go through the hassle of building a bioreactor from purchasing the components and building it from scratch. We can definitely assist in those regards. And those are the people we've heard a lot from. Like the biologists really want to have these sort of piece of equipment there, but they just cannot afford them or they can't get access to them.
Quite amazing hearing those stories, and really encompasses and transcends like outside the lab. You have your agriculture applications down to changing the culture of or the mindset of how education is done, and capacitating these different research groups who may not have the resources to kind of like do the achieve their goals, their research goals. And for listeners who might be on their brink of discovery, their creative discovery, what might you have any advice or encouragement to them?
I think what's very important is that you have to continuously be learning, continuously reading, right? Because it's really about like the way we approach. Well, I approach we in Silo approach our research is that these are all tools in our toolbox to tackle the problems that we have, right? The same technologies that we've developed for MyPCR have been incorporated into the IPRDC. Completely different field, right? One is for like diagnostics, the other is for like biotechnology. But the things that we've done, like liquid handling systems, microfluidics, functionalization of surfaces, these are all things which have a wide range of applications based upon this specific use case.
Mm-hmm.
So it's both. So you have to continuously learn new things, but also you have to continuously understand new things. You have to understand what the functionality of these are. What can be done with them, right? Like if you have a Lego kit, right, to build the Eiffel Tower, you can also use that Lego kit to build an elephant. Like just because the instructions are there, like what's the functionality of those bricks? Those are the same things that we do. We take knowledge where we can find it and try to use it in ways maybe that might not be foreseen, but they can be useful to do so. I guess one thing not often talked about in terms of invention, innovation is that it really is a creative process as well. There is no, there are going to be flash of insight, inspiration, serendipity, and you just have to make yourself. You have to both know. You both have to have the knowledge to take advantage of those opportunities, right? You have to have those skills, and you also have to have put yourself positions where they present themselves too, and that's how you can start to let things mull over in your head a bit and say, oh wait, what about this idea over here? What about that person over there? What if we can use these different things together to solve an interesting problem? That's always how I've approached it. Even for my PhD, which was making the microchip sensors for cancer, that came about because I had never done microchip design in the past. It was not part of my undergraduate training. My seatmate, my good friend, he had worked in the research group in South Africa where they were making light sources on chip. And then the other research group within the building I was working on what they call single photon avalanche diodes, which are these really advanced optical sensors which can detect single photons. And then I had done work in the past on like photoluminescent materials as part of my nanotechnology background. And then my supervisor was working on a project, was working on cancer tumors and looking at oxygen.
Okay.
So all these sort of different threads, listening, talking, understanding. Like I must have interrogated my friend for like 3 hours trying to understand the technology, because it's sort of coming together. It's like, oh wait, I know that these materials can be excited by light, but we now have light that can be made on top of a microchip, and this microchip light is made in the same technology that makes the light sensor. So what if I put the light sensor, the light source, combine it with the sensing material, and use that within the scope of doing these cancer tumor measurements, right? If I had not learned enough in the past, if I had not been listening, if I have not been trying to understand at the core principles and the foundation, like how these building blocks, these Lego bricks work, then the final product would not have been, the final device would not have been created, right? The idea of itself was a creative process of trying to figure out, like, will this work? Will this not work? Like most of the creative things done in engineering, the bulk of the creative is at the start. The rest is just proving that it's actually possible. So I came up with my project idea in maybe like the first 2 weeks, and it took me the next 5 years to get to make it actually happen. But in the end, it worked, right? I proved that physics is real. All of the things that should work on a fundamental level work on a actually applied engineering level. And in general, I think that's also the process we take now with the research we're doing. We know that it should work because we understand science, but it's really just about proving that it will work when we put all the pieces together.
On that note, what's next for Doc Ricky?
So we're continuing to, like I said, one of the reasons I came back was because we wanted to ensure that the things that we do in the lab don't stay in the lab. So we're working on ensuring that we have a sustainability in terms of the outputs of our research. So we want to find ways to engage with research partners, collaborators, potential customers to get the bioreactors, the LC systems, and the materials out of the lab. So we want to spin out, commercialize these either ourselves or with a partner. We're also looking at expanding. We have some projects that we have proposed to the DOST, which are focused on the diagnostic applications of microflakes. So continue on the technologies in my PCR. Like we're really trying to make sure that nothing we worked on gets left behind in the lab and really gets translated outside into like where it needs to go. Like when we write these proposals, when we come with these ideas, we're thinking like, okay, we're making this device because a barangay health center doesn't have anything, right? We want to make sure that this can be used by anybody, right? These techniques. So we do research to come up with solutions to those problems. But like I said a while ago, there's the making potential solutions, and then there is the actual adoption and usage of them, which is why, again, we want to branch out of just purely from just being a STEM-based team to try and encompass more of the humanities, social sciences, and business, to make sure that the things we do are actually things that are used and useful.
So, Doc Ricky, you mentioned that the work must escape the lab. How does it feel like if it's already happening, having the work escape the lab?
So we're currently working on making sure that it does escape the lab, right? I know we've been at it for 4 years now, which seems like a long time, but it's I guess in the research and development scene, particularly here, because there isn't really too much of an industry uptake because the industries don't exist, right? Lots of the things we do in the Philippines are done via import and distribution, which is okay, but I think we have to develop those capabilities locally as well. But that, I guess, because we don't know yet, but what we want, how do you put this? It really just is the key goal for me and most of the, if not all of the team that we have inside of UnSilo, right? It's number one, right? Most of our projects are taxpayer funded. We want to ensure that the things that we do, we're not wasting people's money. And number two, it's really one of the things we want to ensure, and one of the reasons why we work on the problems that we do is because we've put in a lot of effort, learning, training ourselves. We've studied hard, we've done different difficult things, but we want to make sure that those were worth it, right? Like, as speaking for myself, like I could probably go into a corporate world. When I was thinking about whether or not to do a PhD, I had done interviews for the consulting agencies. They're at least in Canada, they recruit very heavily out of engineering courses. So I had an offer from Deloitte to work in their Chicago office. Not offer. I was in the final interview. And I was doing the whole spiel, and then the guy asked me like, "Well, you have can you tell me more about some of the research you did here at MIT?" And I went on and on and on. And I think he and I both knew in that instance that if I had to sit in an office working on spreadsheets and slide decks, we wouldn't have been happy. I wouldn't have been happy. They wouldn't have been happy with me. So it's it's really this feeling of making sure that the things that the effort we put into learning is useful to ourselves and also to the Philippines, right? Philippines has invested in me as a scholar within Philippine science. One of the reasons that I must have come back, because what are all these things for if not to help?
Okay. Why is it essential to reach outside of STEM?
So there's this term, right? S&T, science and technology. So science, right, is really about the fundamental understanding of things, like what's happening, how things work, what's going to happen. There's a bit of prediction involved as well, right? Like with meteorology. Technology is the application of these fundamental understandings into doing a thing,
Sure.
right? Engineering the technology. So like a camera is technology which is developed from the understanding of semiconductors, the understanding of optics, basic science. Very important that we have a foundational science, we have the foundational science to develop technologies. But there's also the I, right? STI, I being innovation. Innovation is actually when technology is being used to solve a problem that has been developed. So engineering and what we do a lot of what we do, right, is S&T, science and technology. We develop the understanding, at least in active, we develop the understanding, and then we develop the technologies. But the actual innovation, the actual application of these technologies to problems are usually not tackled. They're not particularly incentivized, I think, within the academic structure. And that's because engineering we only create potential solutions to a problem, right? We don't actually solve them. Like when we work on things like the MyPCR or the diagnostics in general, we're not going to be the ones running these tests. We're not going to be the ones seeing patients. We're not going to be the ones worrying about the logistics of where these things will go. We're not worried about the regulations that will be enforced to ensure things like compliance with disposal. Waste is a big issue with things like diagnostic tests.
Yeah.
So if we stay within our silo of just S&T, right? If we stay talking to just hard sciences and STEM, right, without engaging with people who have a background in social sciences, in the humanities, in policy and governance, it will remain just a technology. Who will decide whether or not it will get used? It's not going to be us. So this is why we need to ensure that we coordinate, we work with, and we find the expertise of those in the other fields. Because once we have technology, right, let's say we do develop these point of care testing devices, like how are these best deployed, right? Who are the people who will actually use these? Can we work with the LGUs to ensure that at the barangay level, that these devices can be, like the LGUs and the barangay healthcare workers can be trained on these? Can we then work with potentially policymakers to ensure that, because we have a universal healthcare law, right? But how do we ensure that these things help form the solution to the universal healthcare law by actually allowing more distributed and accessible testing for diseases around the country? And for the regulators, how do we interface with the regulators so that when we make these devices, they are usable and pass all the regulatory checks required? So, we can, many things in STEM are developed in a vacuum, right? We need to ensure that the things that we do develop, I guess you can escape the lab. To bring it back to that.
Can you say that the hard part's over?
They're all hard parts. One of the professors in Edinburgh told me is the reward for hard work is more hard work. So we're looking forward to it.
It's like tackling another monster in itself,
Yes,
right?
they're all everything is hard, but you gotta do it, I guess. Or at least somebody has to, right? We often ask ourselves, after work, it's like, why are we doing this? Why us? And the answer is like, we might not always be we're definitely not the most well equipped. We might not always be currently the experts on the topic, but if we're not doing this, then as far as we know, no one else is working on these specific problems, at least in the Philippines, right? So we want to try and change that by, number one, doing it, showing it can be done, and also trying to ensure that other people can start working on these problems as well, right? Really building up that foundation.
Exciting times. That was Ricky Guerrero. Doc Ricky, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and it was really a pleasure talking to you today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I was really glad to share some of the work we've been doing for the past couple of years, and look forward to working closely with IPO and our EdTech to continue to unsilo the things that we're doing.